when a U.S. submarine stunned Japan in WW2 by striking down the Shokaku carrier Part 1. The hunt begins. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface deceptively calm under the blazing June sun of 1944. Beneath those placid waters, USS Cavalla moved like a steel shark, her hull cutting silently through the depths at periscope depth. I pressed my headphones tighter against my ears, listening to the ghostly symphony of the deep that only a sonar operator could truly appreciate. My name is Tommy Morrison, and I'd been working the hydrophones aboard submarines for 2 years now. At 22, I was considered a veteran in this undersea war against the Japanese Empire. The cramped pet sonar compartment had become my second home, a place where sound meant everything and silence could mean death. Every ping, every mechanical rumble, every distant propeller beat told a story to those who knew how to listen. Contact bearings are 20. I whispered into my microphone, my voice barely audible even to myself. The headphones crackled with the distant thrumming of heavy machinery. Multiple screws, big ones, turning slowly and deliberately. My pulse quickened as I fine-tuned the hydrophone array, isolating the sounds that were filtering through miles of dark Pacific water. Commander Kostler appeared beside me like a ghost, his weathered face tense with concentration. "What do you have, Morrison?" "Multiple contacts, sir." "Heavy machinery, sounds like a task force. Bearing consistent at 020 degrees range." Hard to tell at this distance, but I'd estimate 12 to 15 miles. I held up one finger, signaling for silence as I listened more intently. "Sir, those screws. They're big, bigger than destroyers. I'm hearing what sounds like fleet units." The skipper's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. "We've been hunting in these waters for 3 days, following intelligence reports of a major Japanese naval operation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was raging above us. Carrier planes clashing in with the flyboys were already counting Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But down here in the depths, we were stalking bigger prey. All stop," Kostler ordered quietly. "Rig for silent running." The order passed through the boat like a whisper. Within moments, Cavalla transformed from a mechanical marvel into a creature of absolute stillness. Non-essential equipment shut down, crew members moved on silent feet, and even conversations dropped to barely audible murmurs. The only sounds were the gentle hum of life support systems and the distant, rhythmic pinging of our target sonar. I closed my eyes, letting my ears become extensions of the submarine itself. Through the hydrophones, I could hear the Japanese task force approaching with mechanical precision. The sound signatures were distinctive now, the heavy, measured beat of capital ship screws, the higher-pitched whine of destroyer escorts, and underneath it all, the deep, powerful thrumming that could only come from one type of vessel. "Sir," I breathed, hardly daring to believe what my ears were telling me. "I think we've got a carrier in that formation." The effect of my words was electric. Every man within earshot turned toward the sonar station, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and deadly purpose. Carrier hunting was what we'd trained for, dreamed of, and feared in equal measure. Japanese carriers were the crown jewels of the Imperial Navy, heavily protected by screens of destroyers and cruisers, their flight decks capable of launching hundreds of aircraft that could turn the tide of any battle. Commander Kostler moved to the periscope well, his hands steady despite the tension I could see in his shoulders. "Upscope," he ordered softly. The periscope hissed upward with mechanical precision, and the skipper pressed his eye to the viewer, slowly rotating to scan the horizon. "Bearing mark," he called out, and I refined my bearing calculations, cross-referencing the visual contact with the acoustic signature I'd been tracking. The mathematics of submarine warfare were precise and unforgiving. A single degree of error could mean the difference between a successful attack and a missed opportunity that might never come again. "Contact confirmed," Kostler said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Large carrier, appears to be Shokaku class, with full escort screen. Range approximately 10 miles in closing." He stepped back from the periscope, his face grim with the weight of command. "This is what we came for, gentlemen. Plot a firing solution." The torpedo room came alive with quiet efficiency. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez began calculating angles and distances, his slide rule moving with practiced precision as he worked out the geometry of death. The Japanese formation was moving in a predictable pattern, their confidence in their escort screen evident in their steady course and speed. I continued monitoring their approach, noting changes in engine rhythm and bearing. The carrier's massive screws created a distinctive acoustic signature, a deep, powerful thrumming that seemed to pulse through the water like a mechanical heartbeat. 4 shafts, each one driving screws the size of small buildings, pushing 30,000 tons off steel and aircraft through the Pacific at better than 20 knots. Hydrophone bearing 018 degrees, I reported, updating our firing solution as the target continued its approach. Range closing, estimate now 8 miles. Formation appears to be maintaining course and speed. The minutes stretched like hours as we prepared for what could be the most important attack of our patrol. Shokaku was no ordinary target. She was one of Japan's premier aircraft carriers, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and countless other battles. Her destruction would send shockwaves through the Imperial Navy and potentially change the course of the war in the Pacific. But between us and that prize lay one of the most formidable anti-submarine screens ever assembled. Japanese destroyers were fast, well-armed, and crewed by men who understood submarine warfare as well as we did. Their sonar operators were listening just as intently as I was, searching for any sign of an American submarine in their path. Torpedo room reports ready in all respects. Came the report from forward. 6 Mark 18 electric torpedoes lay in their tubes, each one armed with a 575-pound warhead capable of breaking the back of any ship in the Japanese Navy. Unlike older steam torpedoes, these electric fish left no telltale wake to betray their position. They were silent killers, perfect for the kind of precision attack we were about to attempt. As the Japanese formation drew closer, I could distinguish individual vessels in their escort screen. Fast destroyer screws mixed with the heavier beats of cruisers, creating a complex acoustic tapestry that told the story of a major naval force moving with deadly purpose. The carrier remained at the center of this protective constellation, her massive bulk shielded by layers of steel and vigilant eyes. Bearing drift indicates target will pass within 4,000 yards, Rodriguez reported from the plotting table. Recommend coming to attack bearing 05 degrees. Commander Kostler nodded grimly. Make your depth 65 feet. Come to bear 05 degrees. All ahead 1/3. Cavalla began her final approach, moving like a predator closing on prey that had no idea death was stalking from below. The Japanese formation continued on its steady course, confident in their numbers and the protection of their destroyer screen. They had no way of knowing that beneath the waves, 6 torpedo tubes were trained on the heart of their task force. The hunt was about to become a kill. Part 2. The approach the next hour passed in a state of controlled tension that only submarine warfare could produce. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle change in the water around us carried the potential for discovery or death. I sat hunched over my hydrophone equipment, my ears attuned to the complex acoustic environment that surrounded our target formation. The Japanese destroyer screen was impressive. 6 vessels arranged in a protective pattern around Shokaku, their sonar pinging actively as they searched for exactly what we represented. Each ping was a question asked of the dark water. Are you there? Are you hiding? Are you preparing to strike? Our job was to ensure that those questions went unanswered until it was too late. Destroyer bearing 0 degrees, range approximately 3,000 yards, I whispered into my microphone. The escort vessel was moving in a standard zigzag pattern, her sonar sweeping back and forth like a mechanical heartbeat. Active pinging appears to be conducting routine ASW search. Commander Kostler acknowledged with a slight nod, his attention focused on the periscope as he tracked up primary target. Shokaku filled the lens now, her massive bulk visible even at this distance. The carrier's flight deck stretched for nearly 900 feet, her island superstructure rising like a small city from her starboard side. Aircraft were visible on her deck, fighters and dive bombers being prepared for launch or recovery. The carrier's escort screen was textbook perfect, the kind of formation that submarine skippers had studied in countless training exercises. The Japanese had learned their lessons well from earlier encounters with American submarines. and they were taking no chances with one of their most valuable assets. Destroyers patrolled at varying distances, their patterns overlapping to create multiple layers of protection. But no screen was perfect, and experienced submarine crews knew how to find the gaps. The key was patience, precision, and the ability to think like both hunter and hunted simultaneously. We had to predict not just where Shokaku would be when our torpedoes reached her, but also where each escort vessel would be positioned during our attack run. Plotting reports firing solution in 5 minutes, Chief Rodriguez called softly from the navigation table. His calculations were precise works of art, taking into account target speed, bearing, range, torpedo running time, and a dozen other variables that would determine whether our attack succeeded or failed. The mathematics of submarine warfare left no room for approximation. I continued monitoring the acoustic environment, building a three-dimensional picture of the enemy formation in my mind. The carrier's massive screws dominated the soundscape, their deep thrumming providing a constant acoustic beacon. Around her, the lighter signatures of the destroyers and cruisers created a complex pattern of overlapping engine noise and sonar pings. New contact, I reported suddenly, my attention caught by a different acoustic signature. Bearings at 0 degrees, single screw, high speed. Sounds like. Wait. I fine-tuned the hydrophones, isolating the new sound from the background noise. Sir, I think we have an aircraft overhead. The words sent a chill through the control room. Japanese aircraft were among our most dangerous enemies, their ability to spot submerged submarines from above making them deadly hunter-killers. A single plane with depth charges could end our patrol in seconds, turning Cavalla into a crushed steel tomb on the ocean floor. Down scope, Kostler ordered immediately, "Make your depth 100 feet." The periscope hissed downward as Cavalla descended into the relative safety of deeper water. The aircraft noise grew louder, then began to fade as the plane continued its patrol pattern. Through the hydrophones, I could track its progress across the sky above us, the sound of its engine Doppler shifting as it moved away from our position. Aircraft contact fading, I reported after several tense minutes. Bearing now 090 degrees and increasing range. We dodged a bullet, but the close call reminded everyone aboard that we were operating in enemy waters, surrounded by forces that would destroy us without hesitation if they discovered our presence. The Japanese weren't just hunting American submarines, they were actively patrolling these waters, aware that their carrier task forces were prime targets for underwater attack. "Resume attack bearing," Commander Kostler ordered once the aircraft threat had passed. "Bring us back to periscope depth." Cavalla rose like a mechanical whale, her ballast tanks adjusting with precise control to bring us back to the optimal depth for our attack. The periscope broke the surface again, and Kostler immediately began scanning for our target. The Japanese formation had continued on its steady course, apparently unaware of our presence below. "Target bearings are 2 degrees, he reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Range 4,000 yards and closing. Formation is maintaining course and speed." The firing solution was coming together with mathematical precision. Our torpedoes would travel through the water for approximately 3 minutes before reaching their target, during which time Shokaku would move roughly 2,000 yards forward. The calculations had to account for the carrier's speed, the angle of attack, the running depth of our torpedoes, and the precise timing required to score hits on a moving target. "Torpedo room reports, all tubes ready," came the report from forward. 6 Mark 18 electric torpedoes lay in their tubes like sleeping sharks, each one programmed with a specific running depth and course. The electric torpedoes were our most advanced weapons, their battery-powered motors silent and wakeless, making them nearly impossible to detect until they struck their target. I continued monitoring the enemy formation, noting subtle changes in their acoustic signatures that might indicate a change in course or speed. The destroyer screen was maintaining its protective pattern, but I could detect small variations in their sonar pinging that suggested routine rather than alarm. They were conducting standard anti-submarine searches, not the intense, focused hunting that would indicate they'd detected our presence. "Bearing rate indicates target will pass at closest point of approach in 3 minutes, Rodriguez reported from the plotting table. His calculations were confirmed by independent observations from the periscope, creating a firing solution with the precision of a Swiss watch. The tension in the control room was palpable now. Every man knew that we were approaching the moment of truth, the point where months of training and preparation would be tested in the crucible of actual combat. Success would mean striking a devastating blow against the Japanese war machine. Failure could mean the loss of Cavalla and her entire crew. "Final bearing and shoot," Commander Kostler ordered, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "This is the shot we've been waiting for, gentlemen. Make it count." The periscope rose for the final observation, its lens trained on the massive bulk of Shokaku as she continued her steady approach. Through the hydrophones, I could hear the carrier's screws beating their mechanical rhythm, unaware that death was about to launch from the depths below. Part 3. The perfect shot. The moment of truth arrived with the clinical precision of a stopwatch. Shokaku filled the periscope lens, her massive hull presenting a target that seemed impossible to miss yet demanded perfect execution. Commander Kostler's hands were steady on the periscope controls, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what we were about to attempt. "Bearing mark," he called, and I refined our final firing solution, cross-referencing the visual bearing with the acoustic data flowing through my headphones. The carrier's screws were thundering now, their deep mechanical rhythm dominating every other sound in the water. She was close enough that I could distinguish individual engine compartments, the subtle variations in her power plant creating a unique acoustic fingerprint. "Set depth 14 feet, Kostler ordered, specifying the running depth for our torpedoes. The Mark 18s would travel just beneath the surface, their electric motors driving them silently toward their target. At 14 feet, they would strike Shokaku well below her waterline, in the most vulnerable part of her hull, where a single hit could cause catastrophic flooding. Chief Rodriguez worked frantically at the plotting table, making final adjustments to our firing solution. The geometry was complex. We had to lead the target by exactly the right amount, accounting for the time it would take our torpedoes to reach their destination. Too little lead, and we'd hit empty water astern of the carrier. Too much, and our fish would pass harmlessly ahead of their target. "Final solution set," Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Recommend firing spread of 4 torpedoes, 10-second intervals." The firing spread was a calculated hedge against the uncertainties of submarine warfare. Rather than putting all our hopes on a single torpedo, we would launch 4 fish in a carefully planned pattern designed to bracket our target. Even if Shokaku detected the incoming torpedoes and attempted evasive maneuvers, at least one of our weapons should find its mark. "Torpedo room stands ready," came the report from forward. I could picture the torpedomen standing by their tubes, hands on the firing mechanisms, waiting for the order that would send death racing through the water toward one of Japan's most valuable warships. Through my hydrophones, I monitored the acoustic environment around us, listening for any sign that we'd been detected. The destroyer screen was maintaining its protective pattern, their sonar pings continuing in routine sweeps. But I knew that could change in an instant. A single reflected echo from our hull, a momentary glimpse of our periscope, or even an unlucky sonar sweep could turn us from hunter into hunted. "Upscope for final observation," Kostler ordered. The periscope hissed upward, and he pressed his eye to the viewfinder for one last look at our target. Shokaku was magnificent and terrible in her massive power, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, her superstructure bristling with anti-aircraft guns. In a few moments, this symbol of Japanese naval might would be fighting for her life. "Bearing mark," he called one final time. The firing solution was perfect range, bearing, speed, and angle all aligned in mathematical harmony. There would never be a better opportunity than this moment, with Shokaku presenting her full length to our torpedo tubes, her escort screen temporarily out of position for an optimal attack. "Fire 1, Kostler commanded. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air expelled the first torpedo from its tube. I heard the distinctive whine of the Mark 18's electric motor spinning up to speed, followed by the subtle change in water pressure as our first fish began its deadly journey toward the enemy carrier. "Fire 2. 10 seconds later, the second torpedo left its tube, following a slightly different course to ensure maximum coverage of our target area. The electric motors were almost silent, their battery-powered operation creating none of the telltale bubbles and noise that marked the wake of our older steam torpedoes. "Fire 3. The third torpedo launched with mechanical precision, Its course calculated to strike Shokaku amidships where the carrier's aviation fuel storage was located. A hit there would create secondary explosions that could tear the ship apart from within. Fire 4. Our final torpedo began its 3-minute journey toward the target, completing a spread that gave us the maximum probability of scoring at least one hit on the enemy carrier. Now came the hardest part of any submarine attack, the waiting. For the next 3 minutes, we would have no control over the outcome of our attack. Success or failure depended entirely on the accuracy of our calculations and the deadly efficiency of our weapons. All fish running hot, straight, and normal, reported the torpedo room. The Mark 18s were performing perfectly, their electric motors driving them through the water at 46 knots toward their unsuspecting target. The Japanese had no way of detecting the approaching torpedoes, no wake, no engine noise, no visible trail to warn them of incoming death. Downscope, Kostler ordered, and the periscope slid back into its well. Take her down to 150 feet. Rig for depth charge attack. Cavalla began her emergency descent, diving deep to avoid the inevitable counterattack that would follow our torpedo attack. Japanese destroyers were trained to respond instantly to submarine attacks, racing toward the estimated firing position with depth charges ready. Our only chance of survival lay in reaching deep water before they could pinpoint our location. Through my hydrophones, I could track the progress of our torpedoes by monitoring the acoustic environment around Shokaku. The carrier's screws continued their steady rhythm, unaware that death was racing toward them at nearly 50 knots. The destroyer screen maintained its protective pattern, their sonar operators still conducting routine searches rather than the frantic hunting that would begin in a few minutes. Time to target, 2 minutes 30 seconds, Rodriguez called from the plotting table. His stopwatch was marking the moments until our torpedoes reached their intended target, each second bringing us closer to either triumph or the discovery that our carefully calculated attack had failed. I pressed my headphones tighter against my ears, listening for any change in the acoustic environment that might indicate our torpedoes had been detected. Japanese lookouts were trained to spot the wake of approaching torpedoes, but our Mark 18s left no visible trail. Their electric motors were virtually silent, giving no acoustic warning of their approach. The tension in the control room was almost unbearable. Every man aboard Cavalla knew that the next few minutes would determine not just the success of our patrol, but potentially the fate of the entire Pacific campaign. Shokaku was more than just another enemy ship. She was a symbol of Japanese naval power, a veteran of Pearl Harbor whose destruction would send shockwaves through the Imperial Navy. Time to target, 1 minute, Rodriguez announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Through the hydrophones, I could still hear Shokaku's massive screws turning at their steady rhythm. The carrier's course and speed remained unchanged, her captain apparently unaware that 4 American torpedoes were closing on his ship at nearly 50 knots. The acoustic signature was clear and constant, providing a perfect target for our approaching weapons. 30 seconds to target. The final moments stretched like hours. I found myself holding my breath, listening for the sound that would tell us whether our attack had succeeded or failed. In a few seconds, we would know whether months of training and preparation had paid off, or whether we would have to begin the dangerous process of maneuvering for another attack. 10 seconds, Rodriguez whispered. And then, through the hydrophones, I heard it, the most beautiful sound in the world to a submarine sonarman. The deep, resonant boom of a torpedo explosion, followed immediately by a second blast, then a third. Our fish had found their target, and Shokaku was paying the price for Japan's expansion into the Pacific. The hunt had become a kill. Part 4. Thunder in the deep. The sound of our torpedoes striking Shokaku rolled through the water like thunder, each explosion creating a pressure wave that I could feel as much as hear through the submarine's hull. 3 hits, more than we had dared hope for, perfect shots that would have made our torpedo instructors weep with pride. Multiple hits on target, I reported, my voice tight with excitement as I monitored the acoustic aftermath of our attack. Through hydrophones, the sounds of destruction were unmistakable, the groaning of twisted steel, the rush of water flooding into compartments, and, underneath it all, the changing rhythm of Shokaku's screws as her engineering spaces fought to maintain power. The first explosion had struck the carrier amidships, right in the area where her aviation fuel storage was located. The secondary blast that followed was even more devastating, fuel lines rupturing, aviation gasoline igniting, and the chain reaction of destruction that could gut a carrier from within. The second torpedo had hit forward, likely in the area of her magazines, while the third had struck aft, probably flooding her engine rooms. Whispered someone in the control room, the words carrying a mixture of awe and professional satisfaction. We had just accomplished what every submarine crew dreamed of: a successful attack on a major enemy capital ship, executed with precision and deadly efficiency. But our celebration was premature. The Japanese response was immediate and furious. Multiple fast screws, high speed, bearing down on our position, I reported as the acoustic environment around us exploded into chaos. The destroyer screen had reacted instantly to the torpedo attack, their engines roaring to full power as they raced toward our estimated firing position. Count at least 4 destroyers, possibly more, all converging on bearing 020 degrees. Commander Kostler's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Emergency dive. Take her down to 300 feet. All ahead flank. Left full rudder. Cavalla responded like a racehorse, her ballast tanks flooding as she dove toward the safety of deep water. But 300 feet was still within range of Japanese depth charges, and the destroyers above us were closing fast. Their sonar pings were coming faster now, no longer the routine sweeps off a standard patrol, but the focused, intense searching of warships that knew an enemy submarine was in their midst. The sound of Shokaku's death throes continued to echo through the water, providing a grim counterpoint to our desperate escape. Through the hydrophones, I could hear the carrier's hull beginning to break up, bulkheads collapsing under the pressure of flooding compartments, and the distinctive sound of a great ship beginning her final dive to the ocean floor. First destroyer passing overhead, I reported as the high-pitched whine of fast screws passed directly above us. The Japanese captain was following textbook anti-submarine procedure, racing to the point where our torpedoes had been fired and beginning a systematic search of the area. In a few moments, he would be dropping depth charges, trying to crush us with the same precision we had used to destroy his carrier. Depth charges in the water, someone called out, and I heard the distinctive splash of the weapons hitting the surface far above us. Japanese depth charges were deadly efficient, each one containing several hundred pounds of high explosive designed to create pressure waves that could crush a submarine's hull like an eggshell. The first pattern exploded perhaps 200 yards away, the concussion waves rocking Cavalla but causing no damage. The Japanese destroyers were dropping their charges in a standard pattern, trying to bracket our position with overlapping explosions. It was a deadly game of three-dimensional chess, played with high explosives and the lives of everyone aboard both vessels. Another pattern, closer this time, I reported as the second wave of depth charges detonated. These were within 100 yards, close enough that the lights flickered and loose equipment rattled throughout the submarine. The Japanese were getting more accurate, refining their search based on sonar contacts and the estimated position of our torpedo launch. Through it all, the sounds of Shokaku's destruction continued. The carrier was clearly doomed, her massive hull settling deeper into the water as flooding overwhelmed her damage control efforts. Secondary explosions were still occurring as aviation fuel continued to ignite, and I could hear the distinctive sounds of aircraft sliding off her tilting flight deck into the sea. Target appears to be listing heavily to starboard, I reported, monitoring the changing acoustic signature of the dying carrier. Screws have stopped turning. She's going down. The knowledge of that we had successfully destroyed one of Japan's premier aircraft carriers provided cold comfort as depth charges continued to explode around us. The Japanese destroyers were working systematically, their sonar operators tracking our movements with deadly precision. Each pattern of depth charges was closer than the last, a tightening noose of high explosives that threatened to crush Cavalla like a tin can. Take her down to 400 feet, Kostler ordered, pushing our submarine toward the limits of her design depth. At 400 feet, the water pressure was enormous, pressing against our hull with millions of pounds of force. But it was also beyond the effective range of most depth charges, giving us a slim margin of safety. The next pattern of depth charges exploded directly overhead, the concussion wave slamming into Cavalla with tremendous force. Light bulbs shattered, valve handles snapped off, and the submarine groaned like a living thing under the assault. But our hull held, the thick steel plates and reinforcing ribs designed exactly for this kind of punishment. "Hull integrity intact," reported the engineering watch. His voice steadied despite the chaos around us. "No flooding, all compartments secure." Through the hydrophones, I could track the movements of the Japanese destroyers as they continued their search. They were working in a coordinated pattern, their sonar sweeps overlapping to ensure complete coverage of the search area. But Cavalla was deep now, below the effective range of their sonar, hidden in the thermal layers that could bend and distort sound waves. The sounds of Shokaku's final moments were growing fainter, her massive bulk settling deeper into the Pacific as compartment after compartment flooded. The secondary explosions were becoming less frequent, her aviation fuel finally exhausted. But the structural sounds of a great ship breaking apart continued to echo through the water. "She's going under," I whispered, listening to the final acoustic signature of one of Japan's most famous aircraft carriers. Shokaku had been present at Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and countless other battles in the Pacific War. Now she was becoming another victim of American submarine warfare, her destruction a testament to the deadly effectiveness of underwater attack. The depth charging continued for another hour, the Japanese destroyers working with methodical precision to search every cubic yard of water where we might be hiding. But Cavalla was deep and silent, her crew maintaining absolute quiet as we waited for the hunters above to give up their search and move on to other duties. Finally, the acoustic environment began to quiet. The destroyer's crews were moving away, their frantic searching replaced by the steady rhythms of ships returning to formation. The Japanese had lost their carrier, and despite their best efforts, they had failed to exact revenge on the submarine that had destroyed her. "Secure from depth charge attack," Commander Kostler ordered, his voice reflecting the exhaustion that all of us felt after the prolonged ordeal. "Resume normal diving stations." As Cavalla began her slow return to periscope depth, I continued monitoring the acoustic environment, listening for any sign that the Japanese might be planning another attack. But the water was quiet now, filled only with the distant sounds of the enemy task force reforming and the gradually fading noise of debris settling toward the ocean floor. Shokaku was gone, her destruction sending shockwaves through the Japanese fleet that would be felt for the remainder of the war. And Cavalla had survived, her crew intact and her mission accomplished with devastating success. Part 5. The shockwave through the Imperial Navy, the immediate aftermath of Shokaku's destruction, played out in the acoustic environment around us like a symphony of chaos and confusion. Through my hydrophones, I could hear the frantic communications between Japanese vessels, their radio traffic creating a constant buzz of activity as they tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. The loss of a fleet carrier was more than just the destruction of a single ship. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Shokaku had been one of the Imperial Navy's most experienced and capable carriers, her air group seasoned veterans of multiple campaigns. Her destruction removed not just a ship from the Japanese order of battle, but also hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew and decades of accumulated naval aviation experience. Sonar contacts showed the Japanese formation breaking up, I reported to Commander Kostler as we slowly returned to periscope depth. "Multiple vessels changing course and speed. Appears to be search and rescue operations." Through the hydrophones, I could track the movements of destroyers and cruisers as they raced toward the position where Shokaku had gone down. Their screws beat frantic rhythms as they searched for survivors, their sonar pinging constantly as they tried to locate life rafts and floating debris. The normally disciplined formation had dissolved into apparent chaos as individual captains reacted to the crisis. "Up scope," Kostler ordered, and the periscope hissed upward frothed water until its lens broke the surface. The scene that greeted him was one of devastation and confusion. Where Shokaku had once sailed majestically at the center of her task force, there was now only an oil slick spreading across the Pacific, dotted with debris and the tiny figures of men struggling in the water. "My God," the skipper whispered, his voice filled with professional awe at the completeness of our attack. "She's completely gone." Debris field extends for at least 2 miles. Japanese destroyers are conducting search and rescue operations, but there's not much left to rescue. The speed of Shokaku's destruction had been remarkable even by the standards of submarine warfare. The 3 torpedo hits had struck her in exactly the right places: fuel storage, magazines, and engineering spaces, creating a cascade of secondary explosions that had torn the carrier apart from within. Aviation gasoline fires had spread throughout her hangar decks, while flooding had overwhelmed her damage control capabilities. Through the periscope, Kostler could see the human cost of our success. Japanese sailors dotted the water, clinging to debris and life rafts as their rescuers worked frantically to pull them from the oil-slick sea. Many of Shokaku's crew would not survive. The secondary explosions had been too intense, the flooding too rapid, the fires too widespread for effective evacuation. Estimate at least 1,000 casualties, he reported grimly. Very few survivors visible in the water. The secondary explosions must have been catastrophic. The tactical implications of Shokaku's loss were already becoming apparent as we observed the Japanese response. The remaining carriers in the task force had immediately altered course, their captains unwilling to risk their ships in waters where American submarines could strike with such devastating effect. The carefully planned Japanese naval operation was unraveling before our eyes, disrupted by a single submarine attack that had lasted less than 4 minutes. But the strategic implications would be even more significant. Shokaku represented nearly 1/6 of Japan's remaining fleet carrier strength, and her destruction came at a time when the Imperial Navy could ill afford such losses. The experienced aircrew who had gone down with the ship represented years of training that Japan's increasingly strained pilot training programs could not easily replace. Japanese radio traffic indicates major command confusion, reported our radio operator, who had been monitoring enemy communications frequencies. Multiple vessels requesting instructions appears to be significant disruption of their planned operations. The psychological impact on the Japanese fleet was perhaps as important as the physical destruction we had caused. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized the importance of maintaining initiative and aggressive action, but the sudden loss of one of their premier carriers to an unseen enemy had shattered that confidence. The realization that American submarines could penetrate their defensive screens and strike at their most valuable assets would force fundamental changes in their operational planning. Through the hydrophones, I continued monitoring the acoustic environment as the Japanese task force tried to reorganize itself. The search and rescue operations were beginning to wind down, the harsh reality of war forcing the Japanese commanders to abandon their efforts to save Shokaku's survivors. The remaining carriers and their escorts were forming up for withdrawal, their planned operations apparently canceled in the wake of the submarine attack. Contact bearing 045 degrees. I reported as a new acoustic signature appeared on my hydrophones. Single screw, high speed, appears to be a small vessel approaching from the northeast. The new contact turned out to be a Japanese seaplane tender, probably dispatched from a nearby base to assist with search and rescue operations. But her arrival only emphasized the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the Japanese fleet. One of their most powerful carriers had been reduced to floating debris in a matter of minutes, victim of an enemy they had never seen coming. Down scope, Kostler ordered as Japanese aircraft began appearing overhead. Take her down to 200 feet. We've seen enough. As Cavalla descended back into the protective darkness of the deep Pacific, I reflected on what we had accomplished. The destruction of Shokaku would send ripples through every level off the Japanese command structure. From the individual ship captains, who would now have to sail in constant fear of submarine attack, to the admirals in Tokyo, who would have to explain to Emperor Hirohito how one of his premier warships had been lost to an enemy submarine. The immediate tactical consequences were already visible in the confused movements of the Japanese task force. Ships that had been sailing in confident formation now moved erratically, their captains unwilling to maintain predictable courses that might make them easy targets for other American submarines. The carefully choreographed naval operation that had brought them to this part of the Pacific was clearly being abandoned, the loss of Shokaku having disrupted their plans beyond recovery. But the strategic implications would be felt for months or even years to come. Japan's carrier strength had been dealt a devastating blow at a time when their industrial capacity was already strained to the breaking point. The experienced aircrew who had perished with Shokaku represented an irreplaceable loss of combat experience that would weaken every carrier operation the Japanese attempted for the remainder of the war. "Set course for Pearl Harbor," Commander Kostler ordered, his voice reflecting the satisfaction of a job well done. "We've accomplished our mission here." As Cavalla began her journey home, the sounds of the Japanese search and rescue operations gradually faded behind us. But the acoustic signature of Shokaku's destruction would remain in my memory forever: the deep, resonant booms of our torpedoes finding their target, the secondary explosions that had torn the carrier apart, and the gradually fading sounds of a great ship settling into the depths of the Pacific. Part 6. Ripples across the Pacific. The news of Shokaku's destruction traveled through the American Pacific Fleet like wildfire, each retelling adding new details to the story of Cavalla's successful attack. By the time we reached Pearl Harbor 3 weeks later, our submarine had become something of a legend. Her crew celebrated as heroes who had struck a devastating blow against the Japanese war machine. But the real measure of our success could be seen in the intelligence reports that were flooding into Pacific Fleet headquarters. Japanese naval operations had been fundamentally disrupted by the loss of their veteran carrier, forcing major changes in strategy and tactics that would have implications for every subsequent operation in the Pacific theater. The Japanese have pulled their remaining carriers back to home waters, Admiral Lockwood informed us during our debriefing at Pearl Harbor. Intelligence indicates that Shokaku's loss has caused a major reassessment of their carrier deployment strategy. They're no longer willing to risk their remaining flat tops in forward operations. The psychological impact of our attack had been as devastating as the physical destruction we had caused. Japanese naval commanders, once confident in their ability to project power across the Pacific, were now forced to acknowledge that American submarines could penetrate even their most carefully constructed defensive screens. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, already damaged by previous defeats, had suffered another crucial blow. Commander Kostler provided a detailed account of our attack to the assembled staff officers, his clinical description of the torpedo run and its aftermath providing valuable lessons for other submarine commanders. The tactics we had employed, the patient stalking, the precise calculation of firing solutions, the use of electric torpedoes to avoid detection would become standard procedures for submarine attacks against high-value targets. The key to our success was patience, Kostler explained to the rapt audience of submarine skippers and staff officers. We tracked the Japanese formation for hours, waiting for the perfect opportunity. When it came, we were ready to take advantage of it. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in my sonar observations, the acoustic signatures I had recorded providing valuable information about Japanese ship movements and tactics. The sound patterns off Shokaku's screws, the distinctive acoustic signatures of her escort vessels, and the communications procedures used by the Japanese task force would all be analyzed and disseminated to other submarine crews operating in the Pacific. The Japanese response was immediate but poorly coordinated, I reported during my debriefing session. Their destroyers reacted quickly to the torpedo attack, but their depth charge patterns were too scattered to be effective. They were searching a much larger area than necessary, which gave us time to escape to deep water. The broader implications of Shokaku's loss were becoming clear as intelligence reports continued to flow in from across the Pacific. Japanese carrier operations had been scaled back dramatically, with the remaining flat tops confined to defensive operations in home waters. The aggressive carrier raids that had characterized the early years of the Pacific War were no longer possible with Japan's reduced naval strength. The loss had also forced changes in Japanese industrial priorities. Resources that had been allocated to new construction projects were now diverted to anti-submarine warfare systems, including improved sonar equipment for destroyers and enhanced depth charge capabilities. The Japanese were clearly taking the submarine threat more seriously, but these defensive measures came at the cost of offensive capabilities. Our success has forced the enemy to adopt a fundamentally defensive posture, Admiral Lockwood observed during a strategy session. They can no longer afford to take the risks necessary for aggressive operations. Every carrier they have left is now too valuable to risk in forward deployments. The human cost of our attack was something that weighed on all of us, despite the military necessity of what we had accomplished. Shokaku had carried a crew of nearly 1,700 men, most of whom had perished when she went down. The experienced aircrew who had died with Tearship represented years of training and combat experience that Japan could not easily replace. But war demanded such sacrifices from both sides, and the destruction of enemy military capability was the harsh mathematics of naval warfare. Every Japanese carrier that we sank, every experienced pilot who went down with his ship, brought the war closer to its end and potentially saved thousands of American lives that would have been lost in prolonged fighting. The technical lessons learned from our attack were already being incorporated into submarine warfare doctrine. The effectiveness of electric torpedoes against heavily defended targets had been conclusively demonstrated, leading to increased production and deployment of these advanced weapons. The tactics we had used, deep approach, patient stalking, coordinated firing solutions were being taught to submarine crews throughout the Pacific Fleet. Your attack on Shokaku represents the evolution of submarine warfare, Admiral Lockwood told us during our final debriefing. You've demonstrated that properly equipped and trained submarines can penetrate any defensive screen and strike at the heart of enemy naval power. This success will serve as a model for future operations. The strategic situation in the Pacific had been fundamentally altered by the destruction of Shokaku and the other Japanese losses during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan's carrier strength had been reduced to the point where they could no longer mount major offensive operations, forcing them into an increasingly defensive posture that would characterize the remainder of the war. As I walked through the familiar streets of Pearl Harbor, past the memorials to the men who had died during the Japanese attack 3 years earlier, I reflected on the strange turns of war that had brought us to this point. The same harbor that had been devastated by Japanese carrier aircraft was now the base for submarines that had turned the tables on their former attackers. The acoustic memory of Shokaku's destruction still echoed in my mind, the thunder of our torpedoes finding their target, the secondary explosions that had torn the carrier apart, and the gradually fading sounds of a great ship settling into the depths. It was a sound that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of both the terrible power of modern warfare and the skill of the men who wielded that power in defense of their country. Part 7. The final echo 6 months after our attack on Shokaku, I found myself back aboard Cavalla as we prepared for another patrol in the Western Pacific. The war was entering its final phase, with American forces closing in on the Japanese home islands, but submarines continued to play a crucial role in strangling the enemy's remaining supply lines and hunting down their surviving naval units. The tactical and strategic lessons learned from our successful attack had spread throughout the submarine force like ripples across a pond. New crews were being trained in the precise techniques we had used to penetrate the Japanese defensive screen, while improved electric torpedoes and sonar equipment were being installed on submarines throughout the fleet. Our single attack had helped evolve an entire branch of naval warfare. Intelligence reports indicate that the Japanese have only 3 operational carriers remaining, Commander Kostler briefed us as we prepared to depart Pearl Harbor. They're keeping them in home waters, using them primarily for pilot training rather than offensive operations. The submarine threat has effectively neutralized their carrier force as an offensive weapon. The psychological impact of submarine warfare on the Japanese Navy had been profound and lasting. Ship captains who had once sailed confidently through the Pacific now moved their vessels in erratic patterns, constantly changing course and speed to avoid presenting predictable targets to lurking American submarines. The confident, aggressive tactics that had characterized Japanese naval operations in the early years of the war had been replaced by cautious, defensive procedures that severely limited their operational effectiveness. As we sailed out of Pearl Harbor on that gray morning in January 1945, I took one last look at the memorial to the Arizona and the other ships lost during the Japan Sea attack. The cycle of war had come full circle. Submarines launched from this same harbor were now hunting the remnants of the carrier force that had once struck with such devastating effect. The acoustic environment of the Pacific had changed dramatically since our attack on Shokaku. Japanese naval traffic had dwindled to a fraction of its former volume, with most of their remaining ships confined to coastal waters where they could be protected by land-based aircraft and shore batteries. The deep ocean that had once echoed with sounds of major fleet operations was now largely silent, patrolled by American submarines hunting for increasingly scarce targets. Contact bearings are 70 degrees. I reported during our first week on patrol, my headphones picking up the distinctive sound of a small convoy moving through the darkness. Multiple screws. Appears to be merchant vessels with destroyer escort. The targets were smaller now, the massive fleet actions that had characterized the early years of the Pacific War having given way to the grinding attrition of convoy hunting and coastal patrol interdiction. But each Japanese ship we sank represented supplies that would never reach their forces, fuel that would never power their aircraft, and raw materials that would never be transformed into weapons of war. Our attack on Shokaku had been part of a larger campaign that was slowly but inexorably strangling the Japanese war machine. American submarines were sinking Japanese shipping faster than their shipyards could replace it, while surface actions and carrier raids were destroying their remaining naval units one by one. The industrial capacity that had once enabled Japan to wage war across the Pacific was being systematically dismantled by the combined efforts of all branches of the American military. The Japanese are requesting peace negotiations through neutral channels, our radio operator reported during one evening brief, his message carrying news that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Looks like they're finally ready to admit that they can't continue the war. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki provided the final shock that convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender, bringing the Pacific War to a close in August 1945. Japan's brief experiment in Pacific Empire had ended in total defeat, their naval forces reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbors that American submarines could penetrate at will. As Cavalla returned to Pearl Harbor for the final time, I reflected on the role that our single attack had played in the larger story of American victory in the Pacific. The destruction of Shokaku had been one thread in a complex tapestry of naval warfare, but it had been an important thread, helping to weave the pattern of Japanese defeat that had ultimately brought peace to the Pacific. The acoustic signature of Shokaku's destruction would remain with me for the rest of my life, not just as a memory of successful combat, but as a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the skill and courage of the men who had fought it. The deep, resonant booms of our torpedoes finding their target had been sound of history changing direction, the moment when Japan's dream of Pacific dominance began its final descent into the depths. Years later, as I trained new generations of sonar operators in the techniques of submarine warfare, I would tell them the story of our attack on Shokaku not as a tale of glory and heroism, but as a lesson in the precise application of naval power and the importance of patience, skill, and teamwork in achieving victory. The thunder that had rolled through the Pacific depths on that June day in 1944 had been more than just the sound of exploding torpedoes. It had been the sound of an empire dying and a new era being born. The war was over, but the lessons learned in the depths of the Pacific would shape naval warfare for generations to come. The techniques we had pioneered in hunting Shokaku would evolve into the submarine warfare doctrines of the Cold War, while the acoustic signatures I had memorized during countless hours of sonar watch would help train the sonar operators who would stand watch during the long confrontation with the Soviet Union. But on that final voyage home, as Cavalla cut through the peaceful waters of a Pacific no longer torn by war, I simply listened to the sounds of the sea, the gentle whisper of water along our hull, the distant calls of seabirds, and the deep, eternal rhythm of the ocean itself. The thunder of war had faded into memory, replaced by the quiet promise of peace that we had fought so hard to achieve. The story of Shokaku's destruction was now part of history, but its echoes would continue to resonate through the halls of naval academies and the wardrooms of submarines for decades to come. We had proven that properly trained and equipped submarine crews could penetrate any defensive screen and strike at the heart of enemy naval power, a lesson that would influence naval strategy long after the last veteran of the Pacific War had passed into history. In the end, the most important sound was not the thunder of our torpedoes or the death throes of a great carrier, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, and the knowledge that our sacrifice and skill had helped bring peace to a world torn by war. The acoustic memory of that June day in 1944 would fade with time, but the freedom it had helped secure would endure forever. Epilogue. Echoes of victory decades have passed since that fateful day when Cavalla sent Shokaku to the bottom of the Pacific, but the memory of those moments remains as clear as the day they happened. I'm an old man now, my hearing not quite what it was during those intense hours spent hunched over sonar equipment in the depths of the Pacific, but I can still hear the echo of that perfect attack in my mind. The war ended, as all wars eventually do, but the lessons learned in the depths of the Pacific continued to shape naval warfare for generations. The submarine tactics we pioneered during the hunt for Shokaku became doctrine, taught to new generations of submarine crews who would stand watch during the Cold War and beyond. The acoustic signatures I memorized during countless hours of sonar duty helped train the operators who would track Soviet submarines in the deep waters of the Atlantic and Arctic. Cavalla herself became a museum ship, her hull preserved as a monument to the men who served aboard her and the role submarines played in winning the Pacific War. Visitors walk through her cramped compartments now, trying to imagine what it was like to live and fight in those confined spaces. But few can truly comprehend the intensity of those moments when life and death hung on the accuracy of a torpedo-firing solution or the skill of a sonar operator. The Japanese Navy rebuilt itself after the war, becoming an ally rather than an enemy, their ships working alongside American vessels to maintain peace in the Pacific. Former enemies became friends, united by mutual respect and the shared understanding that war was too terrible to be allowed to return to those peaceful waters. But the strategic lessons of submarine warfare lived on, evolving with new technology and new threats. The acoustic principles I learned while tracking Shokaku were applied to new generations of sonar equipment, while the tactical doctrines developed during our attack influenced submarine operations from the Arctic to the South China Sea. The human cost of our victory was never forgotten. Shokaku's crew, nearly 1,700 men who went down with their ship, were remembered not as enemies but as fellow sailors who had served their country with honor and courage. War had made us adversaries, but the sea made us brothers, united by the common bonds of those who made their living on the world's oceans. The technological revolution that followed the war transformed naval warfare beyond recognition. Nuclear submarines replaced the diesel-electric boats of World War II, while guided missiles and satellite navigation made the manual calculations we had performed seem primitive by comparison. But the fundamental principles remained the same: patience, precision, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead of your opponent. As I sit in my study today, surrounded by the memories and mementos of a long naval career, I can still hear the sounds of that June day in 1944. The deep thrumming of Shokaku's screws as she approached her doom, the whisper of our electric torpedoes racing through the water, and the thunder of destruction that marked the end of one of Japan's premier warships. The young men who ask me about submarine warfare today find it hard to imagine a world where such conflicts were necessary, where nations settled their differences with torpedoes and depth charges rather than diplomacy and negotiation. But history is cyclical, and the skills we learned in the depths of the Pacific may yet prove relevant to future conflicts in ways we cannot now imagine. The story of Shokaku's destruction has been told many times in official histories and personnel memoirs, in documentaries and feature films. But for those of us who were there, who lived through those moments of terror and triumph, the real story lies not in the tactical details or strategic implications, but in the quiet professionalism of men doing their duty under impossible circumstances. We were not heroes in the Hollywood sense, charging into battle with flags flying and bands playing. We were technicians, applying the tools of our trade with deadly precision in the service of our country and our shipmates. The thunder that rolled through the Pacific depths that day was not the sound of glory, but the sound of skilled professionals executing a difficult and dangerous mission with the competence that victory demanded. The echo of that thunder still resonates today, in the design of modern submarines and the training of their crews, in the strategic doctrines that guide naval operations, and the tactical procedures that govern underwater warfare. The lessons we learned while hunting Shokaku continue to influence naval operations around the world, adapted to new technologies and new threats, but fundamentally unchanged in their core principles. As the sun sets on my own life, I take comfort in knowing that the skills and knowledge gained during those desperate years of war were not wasted, that the sacrifices made by my generation helped create a world where such conflicts might be avoided in the future. The thunder of war may echo through history, but it is the quiet whisper of peace that we fought so hard to achieve that will be our lasting legacy. The acoustic memory of Shokaku's destruction will die with me and my fellow veterans, but the freedom it helped secure will endure as long as free men and women are willing to stand watch in defense of liberty. That, perhaps, is the most important echo of all, not the thunder of war, but the eternal vigilance that keeps the peace.